I preach from this pulpit every Sunday at 12:45. But it is the first time I do it at this time, and it is my honor to do so. Lazarus and the rich man. This is one of those parables so rich in its content that allows the preacher to preach from different angles. I could, for instance, preach about the dangers of wealth, rich versus poor, life after death, the importance of the law, listening to the prophets, grace, and more. And I will touch on some of that in my reflection today, but from the very beginning, I want to tell you that I believe that more than anything, this is a story about transformation. It is a story in which God is inviting us to be transformed, to change the way in which we embrace the world, to open our eyes to be able to see the things we have right here in front of our eyes and things not so visible. We don't know much about Lazarus. We know his name. We know he was poor and hungry. We know he was covered with sores and that he wanted to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. We are not told how he ended up where he did. We don't know if he was a good or a bad guy. All we know is that he ended up in a good place where he was taken by the angels. We don't know much about the rich man either. We know he was dressed in purple and fine linen, which only confirms that he was wealthy. We know he feasted sumptuously every day. We know he had 5 brothers and that he cared about them. We know that Lazarus used to lie at his gate waiting for some help. We don't know if the rich man is a good or a bad guy. But we know that he ended up in a bad place, in Hades, to be precise. But why? Why did our rich man ended up in a bad place? We know how hard Jesus' words are on wealthy people, especially in the Gospel of Luke, but I don't believe that's our answer. It is not as simple as, let's say, rich people go to heaven, rich people go to hell, bad people go to heaven. That's not how it works. It is much more complex than that. I believe there is nothing wrong with the rich man being rich. Our rich man issue is much more complicated than that. What really troubles God's spirit is that the rich man is so caught up in his own way of being that he stopped caring. He stopped listening to the prophets. He stopped seeing what he had right in front of his eyes. He was blinded by his own rich mentality. He built up a bubble in which he isolated himself from the rest of the world, seeing only the things that he really wanted to see. The parable doesn't say that the rich man was rude to Lazarus. He never asks Lazarus to be removed from his gate. He's not unkind to him. He simply doesn't care. He decided not to see him. Lazarus simply has no place in his bubble. He is too busy feasting every day to care for anything else. Again, I believe the rich man is not a bad guy. And again, there is nothing wrong with being rich. He is just so caught up in his rich mentality, so lost that he cannot make a turn. He cannot look at the world with a different approach. He cannot be transformed because he doesn't even know he is lost in his own bubble. The story continues. Our rich man died, went to Hades, and was tormented. In his torment, he has a valid and kind concern. He wants his brothers to be told not to be like him, to wake up, to make the turn, to open their eyes while there is time. But even while being kind and caring for his brothers, he has still lost his way. And so he acts according to his mentality. He wants to use Lazarus as a servant, as a messenger. Not even in his torment, he can see Lazarus as a person, as the son of Abraham, as the son of God. His petition to Abraham to send Lazarus to warn his brothers is rejected. Abraham refuses, not only because the rich man is still incapable of making a turn and still wants to use Lazarus as a servant, but because there is a chasm that no one can cross. But Father Abraham, if only someone comes from the dead, says the rich man. To which Abraham responds, they have Moses and the prophets. I think Abraham's point was, why will they listen to a poor and outcast coming back from the dead? That's as far as the parable goes. It finishes with a sad and tragic end for the rich man, a victim of his own mentality, blinded by his own way of being. But thank God that's only where the parable ends, not where the story ends. We are all brothers and sisters of Lazarus. And in the same way, we are all brothers and sisters of the rich man. But it is not the rich man or Lazarus that we can identify with in this story, not only because no one of us is as poor as Lazarus, and not only because no one of us is rich enough to feast sumptuously every day, but because in this story, both of their lives have already found their final destination. The characters that we can better identify with in this story are the 5 brothers of the rich man. Those who are still in the world, those for whom the story is told, you and me. Those who still can make the turn and listen to Moses and the prophets. Now, there is a big difference between us and the 5 brothers, and that difference is in our favor, I have to say. And the difference is that God was willing to take the story to the next step. And we actually got one who came from the dead to invite us to be transformed. The one who came from the dead for you and for me is the same one who taught this parable. The one who bridged the chasm between this world and the next, between God and us. His name is Jesus Christ. And we celebrate the fact that he came from the dead every time we gather for worship. We are celebrating it right now. The question for us is it enough? What else do we need? Will we listen to the poor and outcast who took Lazarus' place and came back from the dead to invite us to wake up, to get out of our bubbles, to change our mentality and to open our eyes to see what we have in front of us? Are we ready to listen to what the Lord is saying to His people through the one who came back from the dead? What is keeping us from joining God in His active work of salvation in this world? It was wealth that tricked the rich man. And it was the way of thinking to which he limited himself around his wealth. But it can be something completely different for you and for me. What is keeping us from participating in God's active work in this world today? Who are those in front of us and also hidden from our sight that need us, but in our bubbles we may be ignoring? This parable is an invitation to wake up, to see what God wants us to see, not only what we choose to see. But to be fair, it is easy to get lost. We don't do it intentionally. It is hard for us, as it was for the rich man in our story, because we all have our own problems, our own challenges, and our own banquets. And there is nothing wrong with that till we stop listening to the voice of God and get ourselves stuck in the process of transformation. This parable invites us to think what reality and what kind of people we may be ignoring today. Like Lazarus, they do have a name, but most of the time, they do not have a voice. If you read the story again, you'll notice that Lazarus never speaks. As a poor and an outcast, he didn't have a voice that could be heard because his words would not be taken into consideration. If we don't pay attention, if we don't listen to the voice of the poor and outcast of our day, why will we listen to the invitation of the poor and outcast of Nazareth who came back from the dead so that you and I could live forever? What is blinding us today and keeping us from joining the beautiful work of salvation that God is inviting us to join? As I said at the beginning of this reflection, more than anything, this is a story of transformation. We are all brothers of the rich man. We are the ones invited to listen to Moses, to the prophets, to the one who bridged the chasm between God and us on the cross. And yes, we are still talking about service, and I haven't forgot that. So as we continue to practice and talk about service in our discipleship, there is one more thing that we can learn from this parable. And it points to the reason from which we do service, which our rich man never got. Our rich man wanted Abraham to send Lazarus to warn his brothers to change their way of life so that they could avoid Hades and torment. He truly never got it. Our poor rich man never got it. Not even in Hades could he break the cycle. And it is sad to see how lost somebody's life can get. We don't do service as a rich man thought he could save his brothers from. We don't do service to avoid hell or Hades or whatever it is. We don't do service to feel good about ourselves. We don't do service to avoid ending up in a bad place. We are invited to serve out of pure love. How can we not be moved by the suffering of those in front of us and hidden from our sight? We are called to serve because service is the expression of our love for our neighbor. We practice service because we have listened to the one who bridged the chasm between God and us. We serve because we listen to his voice and because we have been, in some way, transformed. We are practicing service because Lazarus' suffering is Christ's suffering. Because we, again, are brothers and sisters of those we serve. You at Christ Church are doing great jobs because you have listened to the voice of the risen Christ. And we are proud of everything you do and inspire us to do every day. But the work of transformation never ends. And we will not stop. We still have a lot of service to do in God's name. With your love and support, we can do more. We can go from simply listening to the prophets to be the prophets of our time. I invite you to continue the good work that you already do at Christ Church. We are a vibrant body because we have listened to the poor and outcast who came back from the dead to invite us to love. As I said at the beginning of this reflection, this parable can be approached in many ways, but I believe this is a story of transformation. Let's continue to transform lives through our practice of service and through the love of God in Christ. Let me tell you, it is usually the best way to avoid getting lost in our bubbles. And it is also the best way to continue to be transformed. Amen.